as facilitation for the second half of the meeting. So welcome to everyone here. Again, thank you for taking time out of a, I think, gloriously sunny day outside. I've been stuck inside, but it looks like it is. So appreciate your time. And also, I know tonight is the beginning of Ramadan, so we just want to acknowledge that tonight to anyone who celebrates. If we want to go to the next slide, as usual, we will begin with a Zoom orientation. And actually, next slide. Sorry, we're working on our technology tonight. So bear with us a little bit extra. Just a reminder, a couple of reminders, general guidelines for task force members. Please mute when you're not speaking. Please hold your questions and comments for designated discussion times. Use your raise your hand function if you'd like to speak. And I think as of today or some recent time, it is in the reactions. It's easier to find in the reactions button at the bottom. So as we said, Zoom keeps switching it up on us. And for audience members, we ask that you mute yourself and keep your video off except during the public comment opportunities and leave space for the task force members to engage. And then as usual, we'd like to primarily keep the chat open for technical troubleshooting questions. We know sometimes there's some other technical questions, but we want to make sure we can hear from people if you need to in the chat. Next slide, please. So we're excited as usual about tonight's agenda. Starting out right now with welcome and housekeeping. The main presentation is going to be about the pricing sandbox, as we've referred to a couple of times, and tonight you'll finally get to see what that really is. I will do a little bit of sort of sharing a little review on some things we've discussed before and where we are with our current draft pricing principles. And then I'll be turning it over to a couple members of the WSP consultant team who have been helping us with some technical work for the poem project. And there should be some time for questions and answers. And then we hope by about 6:45 to be moving into small group discussions. And we're really hoping to be able to have a good amount of tonight's meeting to allow you to sort of digest and discuss not only what you heard, what you're going to hear tonight, but what you heard last time with the technical information, and really have a pretty, hopefully, robust discussion about where we are. And your thoughts sort of moving forward. And then some time at the end for wrapping up and reporting out on next steps. Next slide. So the meeting number 13 summary, wanting to know if anyone has any questions or suggestions before we finalize that. I have trouble looking at all the hands, but I don't think I see anyone there.
Don't think so, Shoshana. And also noting, we did not get this out with a lot of advance notice to folks. So that is in your inbox. It was included it in our reminder email today. So if you do look at that and notice any edits, feel free to send them our way.
Great. So next meeting slide. Public comment. I also don't believe we got any public comment ahead of time. As a reminder, we always welcome public comment for these meetings, either ahead of time in writing or at the meetings. And so while we didn't get any ahead of time, now I'd like to ask if there's anyone who would like to share a comment in the meeting tonight. And if so, we ask that you limit it to 2 minutes so that we can keep to our agenda. And I do see a hand from Doug Allen. And let me just see if we have any other real quick. If there's anyone else, go ahead and raise your hand. And Doug, do you want to go ahead?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I just want to thank the committee for sending the letter and with your concerns about House Bill 3065. And also the City of Portland's news release on it and Commissioner Hardesty's testimony before the Joint Committee on Transportation. And some of you members of the committee probably know more about the status, but as far as I know, that bill is still active and still could pass. And then there's another bill, 3055, that has much of the same tolling language in it, although it's lacking some of the other components. but that also does the same thing about basically going away from congestion pricing and moving towards tolling for construction purposes. So I just wanted to thank the committee and keep your eyes on those, and hopefully something better can be done with them. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, and looking really quickly, I don't think, does anyone in the poem team see any other hands?
I'm not seeing any other hands, Shoshana.
All right. Well, again, thank you very much, Doug. And we will move along. And actually, that was a perfect segue to on the next slide, Mariana. Just a couple of quick, I'm sorry, my dog is trying to jump into the room. So sorry about the distractions. Just a couple of quick sort of general public project updates before we get into sort of the main topic tonight. One is, as you just heard, thank you for, we shared the letter that you all discussed last time and voted on related to tolling. We shared that internally with city leadership. We shared it with Director Chris Warner of PBOT and Director Andrea Durbin of BPS. And then we also shared it up with Commissioners Hardesty and Rubio. And that was sort of helped the city continue to weigh in with the tolling legislation that is in Salem. And I don't really have a more specific update on that tolling legislation. We do continue to try to advocate to sort of shape the legislation as much as possible to sort of leave the tolling program open so that it can continue to, things like the revenue are not all tied just with the major highway projects, and sort of keep the legislation open so we can all continue having this regional tolling conversation and design it in a way that is in line with the city, and I think is in line with this but it's sort of active, not sure where it will land as of this moment. And then another thing that we did with the letter that you all voted on is we shared it with ODOT's Equity and Mobility Advisory Committee. I know at a couple of our meetings, I think a few folks asked about collaboration with ODOT's Equity and Mobility Advisory Committee. And, honestly, we're sort of trying to think through the logistics and timing of that within sort of our work program and their work program. But as a, initial step, we wanted to make sure that they saw the work that you all had done around how you would recommend tolling be designed. So Michael Espinoza, who is part of the POEM staff team here, sits on the ODOT Equity and Mobility Advisory, sorry, it's a mouthful, Equity and Mobility Advisory Committee. And he shared that letter at their last meeting. So you have a voice into EMAC, even if there's not direct communication sort of yet. And then the last sort of general update, sorry, I'm just seeing Emma's chat. For the last general update, I just wanted to mention last month, as you recall, we heard from Metro about their regional congestion pricing study. And we sent out last week an updated flyer as part of their work for that regional congestion pricing study. They're having an event on April 22nd to bring in an expert panel and sort of review their work, talk about their work, and share some insights from there. They're a group of folks who are all experts in various forms of congestion pricing. And so we sent out the information flyer about that. If you didn't get it, and you're interested, let us know. We think it'll be a really interesting and timely presentation. So we encourage anyone who has the time to attend. It's from 7:30 a.m. to 10 a.m. in the morning. So I know not absolutely the ideal time for everyone, but hopefully it will be. And actually relevant to our conversation here tonight, one of the experts is Daniel Firth, who we heard from a couple of meetings before, a couple of meetings ago. He was with us to talk about cordons, and he's with us again tonight. So one of the experts. And Andy, I see you have a question.
Yeah, I tried to follow that link to the Metro site, and it didn't take me there. It took me to a calendar site, but the event in question wasn't on that calendar. So I think you had a bad link, and if you could send out an updated version, I'd like to watch.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, we'll check that link and make sure that we can get you guys all the information. Yeah. thank you for letting us know. Okay, any other questions about the project updates before we move on? All right, I don't think I see any. So, so moving into the sort of the bulk of tonight's meeting, as we mentioned just now, last month you heard about the Metro study, the regional congestion pricing model study, and tonight's presentation is really meant to build on that. I think I already mentioned we're joined tonight from a number of members. We're joined tonight by a number of members of the POEM consulting team, Daniel Firth, who you'll hear from, who is with C40 Cities, Kevin O'Neill, and Jeff Gibson, who are both with WSP. And before I hand it over to them, I'm just going to do a little bit of context sort of about what we've been talking about and how the discussion tonight fits into all of that. So next slide. So a reminder, last month, I believe we showed this. These are sort of 5 buckets that we are starting to think that the recommendations out of this committee will fall into. You know, of course, the actual recommendations are up to you all, but it feels like there's some different types of recommendations, and the outcome sort of level that we're going to be driving towards is shaping up to look like this. There are some things that we're considering sort of the principles for pricing for equitable mobility, some that are some recommendations that may be nearer term pricing moves, things that the city could do relatively soon and happen, you know, what would happen next after this process. Some items that are really longer term pricing opportunities that, you know, there may or is likely work that needs to get started to advance those, but it's going to be a slower process. They're bigger moves that will take a while. We also hope that there are some things that you all will be recommending around complementary strategies to further explore, just other things that matter. And then really, are there any things sort of just other implementation considerations or other sort of specific potential next steps that you all will want to recommend? And so tonight's presentation is, we have stars on sort of 3 of the 5, where we hope that after hearing the presentation and sort of thinking, you know, seeing what we're talking about, we're going to have a discussion that helps to begin to inform some of these next areas. You know, we realize that we only have tonight and 3 more meetings. So in every discussion from here on out, we're trying to sort of really shape what we've been hearing from you all and sort of help to turn it into some actual solid recommendations. So hopefully the discussion tonight will help to prompt that. And that's the direction where we're going. Next slide. So as a reminder, these we showed these a little bit last month, and this is what we're calling sort of draft principles for pricing for equitable mobility. All of these things are such mouthfuls. When we say principles, we're talking about sort of overarching values that the city could begin to or should center when considering and designing any new pricing for equitable mobility strategy in the future. And we really think having some overarching principles to help guide future decision making could be a really powerful tool. You know, even if a new idea comes along, or some of the ideas that we've talked about are on hold for a little bit, but then they get picked back up. We could also sort of pick back up the principles and recommendations that you all are coming up with. So we've started to sort of gather some of these based on what we've been hearing with you all, from you all. And you know, these are high level bullets of things that we think we're hearing. We sent this out a more detailed draft also not very long ago today. So you should have time to review it sort of after the meeting and things like that as well. And we're going to have a chance to talk about it tonight. But I just want to sort of quickly go over, again, the high level things we think that we're hearing from you all. And these hopefully will not be that much of a surprise. Much of what you see here was written essentially into the tolling letter. My battery is running low. I'm not plugged in, sorry. Let me
Do you want me to jump in, Shoshana, while you go get a charger?
Here, sure, go ahead. Well, or let me just, it said low, I'm not out.
Okay.
Let me just try to get through. This is like the last slide and then handing it over. So sorry, I thought it was plugged in and I don't seem to be. So really quickly, your pricing holds promise for advancing. We think that pricing should prioritize demand management. It should center climate and equity goals throughout design. Revenue use matters. Reinvest in multimodal alternatives, provide discounts, rebates, exemptions for low-income drivers, designed to reduce unequal burdens of technology and enforcement. And really importantly, pricing is really just one tool. It's not pricing alone can't solve everything. So those are more or less the principles that we've heard from you all. Here we go, I can multitask. There we go, now I shouldn't die. And again, we are not going to pause right now and really discuss this, but during the discussion time tonight, we have a fair amount of discussion time and we want to hear from you all how the presentation sort of helps to shape and how you want to refine this. So we can go ahead, and sorry for the distraction there. So one of the other things we want to do is just do a really brief sort of reminder. We shared, or the Metro team shared a lot of information with you all last month. And we're not going to revisit all of that. And I know I'm not someone who can sort of quickly look at a big chart like this and sort of grab a lot from it, but just wanted to sort of walk through a couple of the key takeaways that we heard from Metro when they shared the results of their study. They, as a reminder, they looked at 4 different types of pricing, vehicle mile traveled or road user charge kinds of pricing. They looked at cordons, they looked at parking, and they looked at at roadway tolling. And for each of those types, they did sort of 2 different designs. And the modeling showed there were reductions across all of those areas. There were reductions in vehicle miles traveled, there were reductions in drive alone trips, and there were reductions in carbon emissions. The vehicle mile travel type of pricing and the parking scenarios showed the most positive changes without really any negative changes. And the cordons and roadway scenarios showed some increases in delay and reductions in job access due to diversion. But we do want to be pretty careful in noting that those results were without, more specific design interventions, without investments of revenue, without any sort of exemptions. So, at the high level, there were some differences, but there's a lot more detail sort of in design that could take place. And really that's sort of another reminder that the modeling for Metro, definitely the modeling that we're going to be showing you tonight, is all pretty high level. And if there are recommendations to move forward with any of these, it will, there will have to be a much deeper dive into the specific types, the specific design, specific parameters like exemptions and things like that. So all of this is, it's sort of starting to see if it's worth going to the next phase and more detailed analysis. Next slide. So finally, before I hand it over, just a little bit more about this sandbox tool and why we're introducing it at all at this point, knowing that we did share some technical information with you all last month. So this model that or this tool that we're about to look at, it's not the Metro travel demand model is actually trying to model real conditions in the Metro regional area. This model is not meant to simulate Portland exactly. This is a sort of meant to simulate a hypothetical city. It has some similarities to Portland, enough so that we hope that some of the trends that it shows us are similar to Portland, but it's not an exact replica. And the WSP team tried to build this to align pretty well with the equitable mobility framework and the outcomes that we've said we care about. So hopefully the information will seem relevant to the equity indicators that you all have talked about. That said, there are a lot of indicators in the equitable mobility framework that really we couldn't figure out we couldn't incorporate into this model at this time. So it's not there are, I forget now, 12 or 14 or something different indicators. You're not going to see results around all of them, unfortunately. One of the reasons that we really did want to do this second look is because one thing that this tool is letting us do is to look at a couple of other design parameters, some things like exemptions around for low income drivers, exemptions for zero or low emission vehicles. There was a little looking at the differences between peak and all day charging. And so there's a couple of these, again, high level results, but looking at some of the more specific design things that we think you all are interested in. And we're going to start to delve into the high level results of those, really just to prompt a conversation about what would some trade-offs be. And again, knowing that it's not Portland and it's super high level, it's less about the exact design and more about what are the trends. And again, we hope that this will help you gain some information and get some good questions to ask in this discussion about how do these trade-offs, how does what you're seeing help inform some potential recommendations. And so I think with that, I am going to turn it over to Kevin, who's going to give you even a little bit more information about what the tool is and how what you're going to see.
Good evening, everyone. Greetings from Seattle. This is a multi-city presentation tonight. I manage the planning team here at WSP in Seattle, and prior to that, spent many years working for municipal governments here in the Puget Sound region, including the City of Seattle DOT. So it's really a pleasure working on this project with PBOT and all of you. So it's nice to be here tonight. So just picking up on what Shoshana said, the sandbox model is the four-step travel demand model that includes a land use framework and a transportation framework. So the four steps in a model like this are trip generation, which is based on land use, trip distribution, which is the direction trips are moving in, the type of mode the trips are using, whether they're in cars or transit or transportation network, company vehicles, et cetera. And then finally assigning those specific trips to specific streets. So that's essentially what a four-step model does. So in that way, it's similar to the metro model, which is also a four-step model. As Shoshana mentioned, what's different though, is the Sandbox City is a hypothetical city. There are a number of Portland-like characteristics in terms of socioeconomic factors, including some of the transportation network specifics that I'll talk about in a minute. So in that way, it sort of looks at trying to replicate at least parts of what the Portland metro area are like. But it is a much higher level, planning level model. And really, as Shoshana mentioned, I think the main purpose is to model some things that the metro model couldn't do in terms of not only scenarios that we looked at that Dan will cover in a minute, but also looking at some exemptions and other factors that we know PBOT and I think the task force are interested in. And then in terms of the model behavior, this model could change mode or trip generation. It couldn't change the time of day of a trip that was taken for that last bullet. So next slide, please. I think, so I am not a modeler, but I've worked for many years with travel demand models. And I think the thing that I always say about travel demand models is they're really powerful tools, but they're not the oracle, right? They don't provide the answer. What they do, however, they don't provide definitive answers to decisions, policy decisions, but what they can do is they can help really inform decision making by providing information, and they can also are effective at raising questions or issues. So you see something in a model result and it makes you think, what's going on there? I'd like to understand more about what's happening there. And I think a high level model like the sandbox model is probably good for that, is sort of spurring discussion, which is one of the things I think we're hoping to accomplish tonight. I think it's really important also to emphasize, as Shoshana mentioned, that the metro model was calibrated, meaning ground truth, to the Portland metropolitan area. So it's based on real land use, a real transportation network, the transit network, et cetera. the sandbox model is not calibrated to any specific place because it is a hypothetical city, but again, it includes some factors that are similar to Portland. One thing that we found when we ran the model per the third bullet is that while this model does have a transportation network, when we looked at some of the early results, the network itself probably wasn't robust enough to look at some of the travel time changes that some of the scenarios were looking at. So that was a bit of a limitation in this model. And then finally, I think for this phase of work, similar to what Shoshana said, we're only able to run a narrow set of scenarios and look at a few specific design parameters. And while this helps us get a sense of high-level trends, it also will generate new questions that will need to be looked at with further analysis. And that's, again, some of what we want to try to get into tonight in the smaller group discussion. So next slide. So as I mentioned, the sandbox model does have a transportation network. This graphic here is sort of a high-level representation of what that network is. The model includes a network of streets. It includes regional highways, which are replicated by those darker lines there. It includes a network of arterial streets, collector streets. So what the model does is it distributes trips on that street network in both the baseline scenario, and then it redistributes trips based on the different scenarios that we tested in the model that Dan will talk about in a minute. It also includes a transit network. So like Portland, it includes a light rail system, a streetcar system, which is focused on the central city, and then a bus transit system as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan, who's going to take it away with the next set of slides to more report out on the findings from the model.
Thanks, Kevin. Good evening, everybody. It's really great to be here with you again. As Kevin mentioned, this is a bit of a global multi-city effort. I'm right now in Stockholm, Sweden, where it is, I'm just looking at the time, terribly early in the morning. It's 3:30 a.m. in the morning. So if I'm not completely coherent or on top of things, then I hope you'll have a little bit of patience with me. Just to build on what Shoshana and Kevin have talked about, this sandbox model or tool is based on some work that we did when I was working in Vancouver, BC on a similar effort. And I can understand that some of you are maybe a bit skeptical about this very simplistic tool that we're using. I can say that it was a really powerful tool when we used it with this a commission similar to yours in Vancouver. Partly because it allowed them to kind of zoom out a little bit and not think about the details of their city and what would this do to my trip and the trips that my friends make. But also it just became a really useful, led to some really rich discussions that I hope and look forward to that you getting into this evening. So if you're still feeling a little bit skeptical about it, I'm going to ask you to trust the process a little bit and trust us that we're using a tool that we're hoping is going to help you a lot. And then we'd really like to hear some feedback on whether it did help you at the end, of course. So we've looked, as Kevin said, at a limited set of scenarios, and that some of them are very similar to ones we've talked about before. They're similar to ones that Metro have modeled, but they're not quite the same. And obviously they're in this, this fictitious, simplistic city that we're looking at. So we've looked at cordon pricing. That's a fee on entry, in this case, to the downtown area of our fictitious city. That's similar to the kind of congestion pricing that's employed, for example, here in Stockholm, where I am, that I worked on several years ago. The boundary is about 200 meters that way. Nobody's paying at this time of night, I'm hoping. There's certainly no congestion. We looked at corridor pricing, so paying per, I was about to say per kilometer, but per mile, of course, on limited access highways, so the freeway network or the highway network. Usually paying per distance. You're probably paying when you leave or exit the highway in practice. A citywide road user charge, which is similar to the Origo system, but would be applied in a metropolitan area, probably with a somewhat higher charge, because it's not just replacing the gas tax in the way that the Origo is intended to do, but is doing something else. It's trying to achieve some demand management results. We have a combined scenario, which I think is quite interesting, because I don't think we've looked at combinations before. It gives us some interesting feedback. At the same time, it makes it quite difficult because we can't necessarily tease out what is doing what, but we looked at combining parking fees with some kind of citywide road usage charge, in fact, but only applied in certain key destinations. So areas that we know are generating lots of trips within our fictitious city. And then TNC pricing, so ride-hailing pricing within the downtown area. And I think that was a per mile basis. I'm looking at my colleagues, but I'm pretty sure that was the way that was applied. In all these scenarios, we're applying a charge all day long. The charge values have been calibrated based on ensuring that we are producing some results. So it's a rather simplistic method compared to what you might do in reality. I've been through this process several times in reality, and it's a kind of combination of hit and miss and trying and testing until you get a result that you like and that you're comfortable with, and a balance between the impacts that you're having and the out-of-pocket costs for the people who are paying. There are some other tools that you can use to get you there. And again, just to repeat what Shoshana and Kevin are saying, if we were to do this in reality, this would be quite a long, detailed process based on very much more data and very much more analysis than we have at the moment. For example, the system we developed in Stockholm, I think we had a series of iterations, about a dozen iterations, a committee of politicians meeting on an almost weekly basis to get us to the point where we had a system that we liked. Next slide, please. So this is the table summarizing the high-level results of what we've seen from these scenarios, and it's laid out in a similar way and is using a similar method of illustrating results as the metro results that you saw last month. A couple of things to think about here. So on the left there we have a list of the criteria that are being that are coming out of this model. And we are determining whether they have a positive change or a negative change, and whether that change is large or small. It's important to remember that in some cases a positive change means an increase, and in some cases a positive change means a decrease. That makes this slightly more complicated, but I think it's relatively intuitive. So we want to reduce VMT. So a positive change for VMT is a reduction. A positive change for car mode share is a reduction. A positive change for CO2 emissions and particulate matter is a reduction. A positive change for transit mode share is an increase. We had a lot of discussions about change in TNC mode share and whether that was a positive or a negative, but I think that's an entire policy question on its own that probably needs its own task force. So we made it simple for ourselves and said that it's a positive change if the change in TNC mode share is also associated with a reduction in VMT. So we're seeing that a reduction in a TNC mode share isn't leading to more people driving, essentially, is I think the intention with that one. What we're seeing broadly, and again, I'm a little bit like Shoshana, I have a little bit of difficulty looking at this and drawing lots of conclusions from just a big old mess of green tiles everywhere. But what we're essentially seeing is very similar results to what we saw from Metro, that they're all having positive impacts on the things that we want them to have positive impacts on. There are different dimensions, some are a bit more mixed than others. So in particular, the cordon impacts are somewhat more mixed for a couple of reasons. I think partly because the downtown cordon is a relatively small part of our network, and so is having probably a very large local impact, but we're not seeing it at this kind of zoomed out metropolitan level for our fictitious city. But also that because the downtown area is relatively small, it gives lots of possibilities to divert. It would appear, and it appeared also from the Metro results, that lots of people are using the downtown as a through route to get to somewhere else. Those people are not paying anymore and they're driving around, and that is causing some kind of mixed results in terms of what's happening to VMT, for example, and what's happening therefore to CO2 emissions. Rather more comprehensive systems like citywide road usage charging, also to a certain extent the all highways scenario, are having more comprehensive results. That's again not a surprise. The more people you charge, the more part of your network you're charging, the more of an impact you're having. The TNC, Central City TNC fee in this case is not appearing to make particular impacts. And again, that's not surprising. You're charging a relatively small number of vehicles in a relatively small part of this network. That doesn't mean this isn't a good idea. There could be other really good impacts that it's having. Not least, it's generating some revenues, which is not uninteresting. There are probably all kinds of other benefits that we are not seeing because we're, as I say, both at a zoomed out level, but also we're looking at a limited number of metrics here. Next slide, please.
And Dan, just before actually you go to the next slide, and sorry,
Yes.
we didn't get us at the beginning, folks, but we're, as always, on a tight agenda tonight. So if you have some technical questions, let's save comments and commentary for discussion, but if you have technical questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Jeff and I are going to try to kind of resolve those as we go so that we're preserving time for discussion. I will just flag one question that came in, so maybe Kevin, Dan, or Jeff can answer it verbally, but about just kind of what types of parking fees were considered, or how was that applied in the model?
I think, and my colleagues can chime in, I think the parking fee was applied rather basically. So it's a flat fee that is applying to every trip that is having its destination in this particular area. So it's pretty basic. Because the model results are reflecting what's happening all day, it's relatively simple just to apply a kind of large number, a large fee that is kind of applying to every trip that has its original destination there. It's not therefore telling you what would happen if the length of time you are parked is relatively short. So it's a pretty blunt way of applying it. And again, it's a kind of very basic high level model. I don't know, Jeff and Kevin, if you've got anything to add to that.
Yeah, and I think also, as Dan mentioned, unlike the Metro model, we didn't look at parking alone. We looked at it tied to a road user charge. So it's a good question. And if Jeff can't find the specific answer now, we'll definitely get it out to the group.
But I think the question kind of helps us to think about there are multiple ways of applying these charges that are going to be much more refined and much more locally applicable. So you might charge different amounts at different times of day or different amounts at different locations. There's a lot of variance that you can put in here that will start to address some of the issues that maybe aren't doing the things that we would like them to. I didn't want to spend too much time on those summary results because I think they're essentially telling you similar things that you already saw from Metro. So we're not learning a huge amount new from that. It gives us it gives us an amount of confidence in the model because it is doing the things that we want it to. It's doing things that we expect it to, and it's doing things that are similar to what's happening in the Metro model. So that makes us feel a bit more confident that our sandbox model is doing what we would want it to. So even if it's not fully ground truth, we're doing kind of very basic ground truth that there are no nasty surprises within that, apart from some of the ones that we've mentioned before. But what is interesting here is the possibility to look at some things that I know are of great interest to this task force, and quite rightly so. The first one is what happens if you apply some kind of low income exemption. We've defined low income. I think I'm correct in saying it was the lowest quintile of income. So it's something below $25,000 if I'm correct. But don't worry too much about exactly where that number is. It's more about the proportion of the trips or the people within our fictitious city who are receiving this discount. Now, it's really difficult to kind of in advance predict what a low income discount is going to do. There are two directions it could go. One is that people on lower incomes we know are going to be more price sensitive because they don't have as much money, and therefore they are more likely to change their behavior in response to a price signal. On the other hand, because driving isn't free, it's a cost in the beginning. We know that people on lower incomes are likely to have minimized the amount of trips they're making anyway. So it's to what extent are the trips that are left over discretionary. So it's a bit of an interesting kind of push and pull, and we're never quite sure how it's going to play out until we see it. What we are seeing though is that these scenarios are still showing quite good VMT reductions. It's less than we are seeing with a baseline without any exemptions at all, but it's still showing some positive movement for VMT, and therefore VMT it's also being reflected in things like CO2 emissions and particulate emissions. And I'm pretty sure we'd also see similar kinds of things happening for mode shares and other things that we're interested in. So it's a really interesting way to kind of understand what might be happening with low income exemptions. I think there's sometimes a concern that if you put in too much of an exemption, then you're going to lose some of your results, and obviously you do. But it's the extent to which, again, you're making that balance between the results that you want to see, the impacts you want to see, and the out-of-pocket costs for individuals and how we are potentially harming people. Next slide, please, unless any of my colleagues have any comments on that one. The second parameter we looked at was what might happen if you apply an exemption, so a zero cost for zero or low emission vehicle exemptions. Again, difficult to know exactly what's going to happen. The VMT reductions obviously again are reducing somewhat because you have fewer people are paying, and therefore you're not having the same impacts that you might have wanted. This exemption, I think when we look back at how we'd applied it, it seemed to apply to rather more vehicles than you might want to. So it was quite a generous exemption in terms of how we defined a low emission vehicle, for example. Is this a good or a bad thing? I think is a really interesting question, and comes back to one of the fundamental questions that I think you need to, and I'm sure you understand this as a task force, be addressing. That's what is the primary purpose of your program. What the purpose is really important for how you're applying it, and therefore what results you want to see. So if your primary goal is to reduce VMT or in some way manage demand, then you might want to think very carefully about whether this is a good exemption to apply or not. It's probably having some really good impacts on some things, but it's obviously having quite a big impact in this case on reduction with VMT. But again, as I say, this exemption that we applied seemed to apply to rather more vehicles than maybe you might want to. We'll need to dig into this a lot more. There's again a bunch of things that you could do. Be much more strict about the exemption that you apply. Maybe if you only applied it to absolutely zero emission vehicles, which at the moment is about 4% of the vehicle fleet in this fictitious city, which is again based on data from Portland. An exemption doesn't need to be a kind of binary yes or no thing. It can be maybe a 50% exemption or a 75% exemption or a 25% exemption. So you're sending some price signal saying we do want to impact on VMT, but the kind of VMT that you are producing because you have a zero emission vehicle is less damaging in some ways, and therefore we might want to give it slightly more of a discount. From an equity perspective, right now, I would want to be thinking about who is driving these zero emission vehicles. There's a risk that if you were to apply it tomorrow, then it might be having, to a certain extent, a subsidy to people on higher incomes who are able to afford newer, cleaner vehicles. That's going to change quite quickly, I think, over the next few years as more and more cheaper vehicles become available, and not least as the second-hand market for zero and low emission vehicles starts to accelerate in the coming years. But getting back to what's the purpose of the program, if your purpose is to reduce GHG emissions, then this could be a really powerful way of doing it. And there's some really great examples. For example, again, the congestion pricing system we implemented in Stockholm, when it started, had a discount for low emission vehicles. Again, it was quite a generous one, but it was a discount. And some research we did showed that had a really profound or a really large effect on vehicle choice, not just within the city of Stockholm, but almost nationally, in terms of this was a really big signal to people that, well, how should we put it? The city of Stockholm was saying the era of the internal combustion engine is over and you need to be thinking about what kind of vehicle you're driving. So even if you're not driving to Stockholm very often, it became a really important signal. So it has potential to produce some really quite substantial GHG emissions because it's impacting on people's vehicle choice. The other example maybe to look at there is London, where London effectively has a two-layered charging system. One, the congestion charge, which is applied to manage demand and to address congestion, and a second charge on top of that called the ultra low emission zone, which is charging more for the more polluting vehicles. So again, there's multiple ways of applying this discount or this exemption that can really kind of fine tune exactly the results that you want to be getting. Is someone keeping an eye on the chat? I'm seeing there are things coming in, but I'm not.
I think we're good, Dan. There was a question about how low income was defined, but that's been addressed by Jeff and Kevin.
Excellent. Thank you, my wonderful colleagues. I'm running a little bit behind, so I'm going to try and speed up ever so slightly without losing any of the richness. So the next slide, please. So we looked at all day versus peak only charging. So I said that most of the scenarios or all the scenarios were based on all day charging, except this particular variant where we looked at what might happen if you only charge during the peak. So it's effectively during the rush hours. I can't remember exactly how much it was, but I'm guessing it was 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening. That's generally the way it's done. A really thing to remember here is the model limitation that trips aren't able to shift time. So having one of the purposes of peak charging would be to kind of smooth out this curve of the peak. We're used to trying to smooth out the curve now in these COVID times, but this is smoothing out the curve of traffic. how do you smooth out that peak so that you maybe spread out the rush hour a little bit would be the primary purpose of peak charging. And we're not seeing that effect because it's one of the limitations of this model. But we are seeing that this peak scenario with it's also leading to fewer vehicle miles traveled. It's reducing private car mode share and carbon emissions to a lesser extent than we would see in the old day scenario, and that's again entirely reasonable and predictable. People who are driving in the peak often don't have the same choice to be doing it or not. They're probably, most of them, not all of them, but most of them are probably driving to work. The time that they can arrive at work, but even the ability to get to work or the choice of destination for work is relatively limited, obviously. That's very different from the kind of trips we're making during the day. If you're going shopping, if you're going to visit relatives, if you are driving for leisure, or not driving for leisure, but going to leisure locations. Hopefully not many people are just driving around for leisure, but some are. Those kinds of trips are what we call discretionary, and it's much easier to either divert them to somewhere else or use a different mode or choose a different destination. Or if you're shopping, maybe you can shop online instead. So we know that pricing has a much bigger impact between the peaks than it does in the peak. So those differences are slightly less is not surprising. Generally, we say that about a third of all trips are being made during these peak periods. But as I say, these peak period trips are less price sensitive and therefore less likely to change, less able to change. This, I think, again, comes back slightly to what your purpose is. If one of your important purposes is to reduce congestion, then charging more during the hours where there is more congestion could be more interesting. It really matters when and where you are reducing demand. If you're reducing demand when demand is highest, then you will have the biggest impact on journey times and journey time reliability. If you are reducing demand when demand is lowest, then you're having good impacts on things like GHG emissions, but you're not necessarily having the impact that you might want to see on other things like congestion and journey time. Next slide, please. So finally, we know how important racial equity is to this task force discussion, and very rightly so. So we were asked to consider if there are any disparate impacts to Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. Again, the sandbox model is based on Portland, so we've imported some of the demographics, but it's not an exact replica. This is just a high-level look to see what might be happening. So this chart is showing the comparison of all-day no exemption charging on BIPOC and non-BIPOC households on an average basis. This is only looking at VMT reduction. So again, it's a relatively limited set of things that we're looking at. The VMT reduction is quite powerful because it tells us a lot about what other things might be happening. And we're seeing from a VMT perspective that there's a similar reduction level for BIPOC communities and non-BIPOC communities for the pricing scenarios compared to the baseline. So on the one hand, this could be seen as a good thing. At least we're not seeing BIPOC communities being impacted differently by the charges that we've applied. On the other hand, we know that BIPOC communities are starting from a lower base in terms of vehicle miles traveled. So if your aim was to reduce the unequal burden, we're not seeing any evidence that that is happening either. So I think this is one example of where we would need to dig in considerably more to understand exactly what's happening. I think, as I say, that the headline is maybe it's not having a differential impact, but that really depends on the starting point that you're at. And in particular for this question, I'd want to be looking at a lot more metrics than just VMT, digging into all kinds of details about exactly what kinds of impacts this is having and whether that is achieving the kinds of impacts that you want to be having. And I think that was my last slide. Only 5 minutes over.
Thank you so much, Dan. And Mariana, I'm actually going to have us move ahead. I'm sorry, guys. I know we're throwing a ton of information at you. I think we're doing a good job answering questions in the chat. And the nice thing about having 3 consultants is we're going to have one in each of our small groups. So I think that we can kind of follow up with some of those just like technical understanding questions in those spaces, if that's okay. I just want to make sure that we kind of recapture some good time for discussion. And we know that we have thrown a lot of data and information at you. Some of you, I think, were really hungry for that. And so we hope that the last kind of meeting and a half have been really rich. But we also know it's like a ton to process. And so that's why we really want to preserve kind of most of the rest of this meeting to just talk. And we've got some good discussion prompts. But one thing we want to do to kind of kick off that discussion and really give you some fodder and food for thought in your small groups is something that we've done a lot with this group, is kind of throw a poll at you. This one we're calling a gut check. We've called them temperature taking polls in the past, but this one will be a gut check. And what we're going to ask you to do is something really hard. We're going to ask you to rank some longer term pricing strategies based, yes, on what you saw tonight, but also what you saw last week from Metro, and really what we've been talking about for the entire process. And I see your question, how I'm going to get to that in the next slide. So actually, let's go to that next slide right now. Mariana, if you could do that. So when we say longer term, now this kind of goes back to what Shoshana framed up of like the types of recommendations we think we're going to get to at the end of this process. There's going to be a bucket of some nearer term moves. Those are the things that, yes, are going to require more work and analysis, but the city could feasibly or theoretically implement because, maybe they're in our jurisdiction, or they could happen. I don't want to throw a number out, but say like within the next 5 years. Longer term strategies are kind of what we've talked about, will likely require some interjurisdictional coordination. They're just bigger, kind of often more regional approaches. And what we have talked about in our process are these 4 on the screen. So highway tolling, which we know is kind of a more medium term because of what's going on with ODOT, but think of kind of a highway tolling that's going to take several years and a lot of partners to pull off. Road usage charges, which is the pay per mile on all roads, the kind of Origo model. A longer term kind of vision of parking management, which is sort of more dynamic, potentially more expanded, and really about regulating demand. And then finally, a central city cordon, similar to what we've got in London and in Stockholm. So what we are going to ask you to do is, again, something really hard. You're going to hate it because you're going to say, but there's so many nuances and things to do. But we're going to ask you to rank these. We're going to ask you to kind of think about the question of which of these shows the most promise for advancing equitable mobility in Portland based on the information we've talked about today. You're going to have a ton of time in your small groups to kind of wrestle with, but I didn't know this, but I'd want to know that. But for now, we're just going to ask you to do the kind of uncomfortable ranking exercise just to see where our gut check is.
Emma,
So
Emma,
go ahead,
I'm sorry.
Shoshana.
Can I just really quickly, two things. One, based on the information that we showed you today, and actually, like really actually not, we want you to use today's information, and we want you to use sort of all of the information. And then 2, I also just wanted to clarify, on this screen, we're saying road usage charge, whereas in both sets of models, we refer to that as a VMT charge. So it's the same thing. It is a per mile, per vehicle mile traveled, or per gross usage charge. But I realize that's confusing here, calling it a RUC when we just called it a VMT.
Thank you for clarifying that. And I'm sorry, I meant to say to date, not today. So all the information we have seen to date, including the Metro information and all the discussion. But so what we're going to have you do is what we've done a few times, is we're going to have you go into SurveyMonkey in order to do this ranking question. So Mariana, can you go to the next slide? I'm also going to post this link into the chat, but I know sometimes folks who use their phone or their tablet struggle with the chat. So you can either type in the URL or you can click that link that's there. And I'm going to ask you to go in and answer that question and do this ranking. And I'll give you a couple minutes to do that. And then we will look at the results together.
Emma, I have a question. With the ranking, is 1 the most promising and 4 the least promising?
Yes, thank you for clarifying that. 1 is most promising, 4 is least promising. so quiet. I can hear you all thinking. And probably cursing us a little bit for making you do this very hard and unfun task. And I see you, Shawnee. I see that I don't love it. And I feel that. And we'll be able to talk about that. And I promise this is not, I should have said first off, this is not a recommendation. This is not a vote. This is not a final thing. This is a throw some stuff at the wall to just see what we're seeing, and then use that to spark some really good and rich and nuanced conversation. This is why Shoshana kicked off the meeting, because we knew that you were going to get really mad at me by this point. So all right, I'm seeing let's see, 11 responses so far. There's 12. I'm not sure how many folks we've got tonight, so I'm going to give it 30 more seconds. Make sure everyone gets a chance to respond.
I think we've got more folks, so.
I think we do. Okay, if you haven't hit submit yet, please go do that. I'm still seeing just 12. And if anyone's having issues or kind of technical difficulties, please holler. We would love to help. I can even take it for you if you send me a private chat. Now I've got 13. Okay, last call, 15. I think we're getting really close. Okay, folks, I'm going to call it there at 15. If it changes, I will let you know. But I'm going to take over the screen sharing for a second from Mariana. And are folks seeing my screen and a bar chart?
Yes.
Okay, Shoshana's nodding. And let me see if I can zoom in. Okay, here's what we see from this no good, horrible, rotten question. And Vivian's saying make it bigger. Is that better? I can interpret it as well for you. Okay, really close ranking. So what SurveyMonkey's doing is it's aggregating all of your different rankings, giving it a weighted score and throwing it on here. When we get into our small groups, the first thing you'll get a chance to do is kind of explain how you ranked things, talk about how mad you are at me, and also kind of explain a little bit of the why. But what I see here is by like a little teeny bit road usage charging, VMT fee or a pay per mile is edging it out as sort of the one that by the weighted scores is coming out as the one collectively it looks like we feel has the most promise for advancing equitable mobility. Followed by, sorry, it's chopped off there, but that was the more dynamic demand-based parking. Followed in third then by highway tolling, and then central city cordon down there. And so that is very, very interesting. And I want that to kind of be something that's percolating in your mind as we embark into our small groups. So Mariana, can you maybe re-share your screen so I can just flash up the discussion questions really fast? Great, and you can click ahead a couple slides. Perfect. Okay, so we're going to break you into groups. In every group, you're going to have a facilitator, a note taker, and a consultant to grill with all your questions. But what we're going to be doing for the next a little more than a half an hour, is first talking about that ranking, talking about how it felt and what you ranked highest and why, and what you ranked lowest and why. And then we're going to talk about what made that hard and why that was a really not fair exercise, and what information you would have wanted to make it easier, because that's really going to inform the kind of what would we need to explore and further in the next phase of analysis. And then finally, we're going to spend some time looking at those draft principles that Shoshana showed at the start of the presentation, and just kind of talk about if anything tonight validates or changes what we've talked about as a group. And I'll just let you know that when we come back together, I'm not going to make you do the forced ranking again, but we are going to take a little bit more of your input and feedback on these longer term strategies, because hard to believe it, folks, we're almost at the end of our process. And so we are going to need to start kind of coalescing around, how we're feeling about these things, even if it's, I don't feel certain or I need more information, but we're going to push you a little bit so that we're really pulling out some good fodder for some final recommendations. So with that, unless there are any questions about what we're doing, your facilitators will take care of you. And I think Michael is going to split us up into groups.
All right, I will open all the rooms.
Thank you so much, Michael. Hi, folks. Welcome back. I hope your discussions were as awesome and interesting as my breakout groups. It's never enough time. I'm sure you all are sitting here on a beautiful sunny evening and like, yeah, but it is enough time. I'd like to go eat dinner. But I'll say what I said to my group at the end is it's an honor always to spend this time with you guys. You have just been such a rock star group, and I learn something every single time. So thank you. Thank you. So we're going to do a little report out, kind of go round robin and let folks share just some key takeaways. I'm trying to keep an eye on the time. We have a little bit more to do, so try to keep it between 2 and 3 minutes, everyone. But I will start with Shoshana's group. If you are reporting out or if someone from your group is speaking.
I'm going to start, and I invite people to add a little bit quickly, of course. So a few things that came out were there were a number of folks who expressed an interest in parking, and less interest, I guess, similar to the survey, less interest in cordons. I think there was a little bit, at least, of a theme of strategies where the city of Portland has control. It makes sense, at least for now. We also had some really great conversation around really needing to sort of be more careful around definitions of low income. There are a lot of people who are struggling. You know, a low income exemption just isn't really going to make all of this okay for a lot of people. And so it's a more complicated conversation, making sure that people have the information, they know how to access any low income exemptions that are available, things like that. Really important to any forward movement. As well as things around privacy, technology privacy, enforcement. What would be the enforcement mechanism for any of these strategies, and really needing to think about that. There are tragically more and more examples every day of why that's so critical. And maybe before new charges of any type are put in place, we need to make sure that we're having a conversation about how would they be enforced. And as well, more data and the need to really understand who is, I think, something that has come up again and again about who is actually traveling where, by what mode, things like that, before we actually put new charges in place. Those are a couple of the highlights. I don't know if anyone in my group wants to, if there's anything critical I missed, let me know.
Thanks, Shoshana, and thanks to your group for really great contributions. I will kick it over to Eric's group, or a representative from Eric's group.
I'll do that. We had so much good, robust discussion. I didn't get to summarize and do all of that, but I think Nell did a great job capturing some of that. So I think overall there was, I think, a fair amount of consistency in sort of the rankings and sort of the theories behind some of that, namely that the road user charge, by really touching all trips, seemed like it had a lot of potential there. So I think we had some good discussion recognizing that how those are designed can be really impactful in terms of what we're caring about, particularly noting that a lot of the current discussion in the legislature and the state level is about replacing current revenues, not necessarily sending new price signals in order to advance changes in the system. And so I think that's an important distinction that people wanted to make, and that also people reflected that means we have to be very clear and specific about what we're actually meaning here. There's some sort of broad categories we're talking about. So what do we really want to see in them, knowing we're not going to implement the full thing, but those kind of distinctions, for example, demand management versus a revenue replacement RUC, is a pretty important distinction to the group, I think it's fair to say. Similarly, there was a lot of interest in how readily things could be implemented. There was a lot of urgency in our group where longer term sounded way too long for a crisis that we're facing today, or multiple crises we're facing today. So try to assure them we weren't talking another 20 years, but I think how we get moving on the bigger moves is a theme I heard pretty strongly from the group as well. And that relates to things like the road user charge or others that might require multiple jurisdictions. How do we make that moving forward? Really important, I think, urgency from their perspective. Similarly, I think the note, one key theme emerged was making sure that policy is driving the pricing, not revenue per se. That if we want to advance equitable mobility, we need to be thinking about those outcomes, not just the revenue outcome. while the group also recognized that investing in a system that lets people get their needs met in ways that advance equity and don't challenge the climate does require investment. And so the revenue and how we spend that remains really important, as the group has noted. Additionally, I think there was a good conversation in terms of the frustrations or the what else we want to see, recognizing that so far these were kind of done in isolation, and that the ability to combine some of these would be really important. And I think that's something that the tool can let us do that the Metro model won't in the near term. And so in looking at that, there was a note that actually combining parking with a number of them would be interesting, because parking seems promising and something within the city's jurisdiction that we could advance, even as others noted we want to advance it outside of the city too, if we're really going to be impactful here. But that I think coupling those would be of interest, and also maybe a few other combinations. So I think that's an area we could get more input from the group on as we have a couple more months of exploration. Let me jump back to those notes real quick to see if I'd highlight a couple of other pieces. Design matters again, but also so does leadership was a key theme. That at some point, us talking about the perfect for another 20 years is not going to do anything to advance equitable mobility, and us figuring out maybe what the low-hanging fruit we can start with are and then continue to move through those is really important. So I think implementation was a key theme, including how does this group maybe start to engage in that a little bit here at the end by forming recommendations in terms of understanding what might be a good sequencing to get into early actions to get things moving. So I think those are probably the key themes to share here. There's richer notes from Mel. Thank you very much that we'll be able to capture there. Anything else from the group that should be noted at this point? Great, thank you.
Awesome, thanks, Eric. Well, I'll round us out. I also didn't do a great job facilitating, and so we'll have to do the report out because we didn't have time to assign or nominate someone. But I really welcome my group to chime in if I miss anything. Interestingly, we had quite a few different opinions on the ranking. There wasn't really a consistent kind of number one or number four. And I think that's because folks talked about how they approach that question. Whether you're approaching it from like what's best for the system versus kind of what's my personal as a user of the system and kind of what personal impacts might we see. As Dan mentioned, the goal of the pricing program also matters. If your goal is really demand management versus if your goal is really making a more equitable system, or if your goal is really about climate, that all really impacted folks. And then similarly to I think what both Eric and Shoshana said, the implementability was a key one. So the folks that did kind of rank parking up high, I think it was because that infrastructure is already there in a lot of ways, and the city can play kind of a key driving role. But yeah, very much differing opinions in terms of the ranking. What made it a hard deliberation was really the lack of data. And I don't think we can overstate this enough. My group was like, we need the data. We need the data on who is driving and traveling where, who would pay in these situations. And until we kind of can get that and get kind of deeper than a more theoretical conversation, it's really hard to truly answer these questions. So that would be kind of a really important and critical step as if the city carries pricing work forward. And then we spent quite a bit of time kind of just talking at a values level and a principles level about what questions this raises. There were some really interesting discussions about, this is privatizing public facilities in many ways, and what concerns and implications does that raise. On the other hand, kind of talking about the cost or the hidden costs of the status quo where things are unpriced, and so how you kind of balance that as you approach it from an equitable mobility space. We talked a lot about revenue use, and again, kind of doubling down on the importance of that. Well, not, pricing, as we've talked about it, not being a primary goal of revenue generation, the way you utilize that revenue is critical to, Val brought up the term transportation justice, how you create a just pricing system. And, our current principle list talks about multimodal alternatives, but several folks in our group talked about the need to expand that and talking really about housing and about land use and about the broader system and what is privatized and public in our society and how that all interplays together. So tons of rich stuff to talk about there. Just two last things I'll call out. We talked about, safety. Safety is a key indicator on our equitable mobility framework. We have to be really honest about the safety implications of other alternatives. And when we think about complementary strategies and reinvestment opportunities, thinking about safety, how you make biking, walking, and transit safe and healthy alternatives is really critical. And finally, you know, we can't compliment this group enough. You guys are amazing, but we do have to talk to other people, and it's got some really good advice on, you know, meeting people where they're at and starting the conversation about how this would impact people and what they think about that and what they think about these trade-offs beyond the 19 fabulous folks we've got here. My group, anything else that I missed? And Mike, thank you to Michael for the robust notes. Okay. Well, guys, we have 10 minutes left, and we are going to do two things in those 10 minutes. I'm going to have you take another poll. Please don't hurt me. This one is a nicer poll in that it's not going to force you to rank things. It's going to ask you to go through the 4 kind of buckets of strategies we've talked about tonight and kind of do a bit of a green, yellow, red scale. Green, you know, would be, I think this shows significant promise. I mean, yes, we got to keep in mind all the principles and all the design pieces, but I think that this shows promise for advancing equitable mobility. And I think the city should advance this for further analysis. The yellow, the middle is kind of, I think this shows some promise, but I'm not sure. I really need to think about it more and discuss more. And the red would be, I really don't feel like this is going to advance equitable mobility. I want to say this is not a formal vote. We're not taking what you say tonight to the bank. But as Shoshana mentioned, we're getting really close to the end of our process. And so similar to how we did with our tolling letter, what we're going to try to do as staff is pull out from the notes, pull out from your feedback, and really start crafting these into some draft recommendations for you to consider and refine as we kind of head towards July. So I'm just going to ask that you're not walked into any of this, but it is, I want you to really consider the answer to this question. So I will paste in the link again.
And I just want to, can I just stress the word, you know, especially after this conversation, and we know there are so many more questions, but the first one, the green, is, I think it holds promise sort of for further analysis, not, I think you should do it, you know, in 2 years or something like that. But just, you know, we know there's so much more that needs to be done, but still, do you think it holds enough promise to sort of take it to the next stage? So just
Thanks,
feel like it's
Shoshana.
important to stress that.
Got to get the Jeopardy theme song so we can play it during these times, but I haven't done that yet. Maybe by July. I'll give you guys a couple minutes to respond. If anyone has any issues, technical issues, let me know. I also just love Shawnee's comment that I just saw. Data is a thing. It is a thing. It's a big thing. It's such a hard thing, but it's a thing. All right, folks, we're getting close. I think I've got 12 people in. And Monique, thank you for messaging me. Monique may have taken the poll twice. That's okay. This isn't, we're not taking this to the bank. But I appreciate your honesty. No one's stuffing the ballot box. Okay, I think I've got everyone in. So here we go. I'll share my screen one more time. Okay, and I will try to do the thing again where I zoom. And can I get Shoshana or someone to nod if they are seeing this? Michael is nodding. Perfect. Okay, really interesting results here, guys. We've got a mixed bag for highway tolling, but the majority are kind of in the yellow and the red. Central City Cordon, we're seeing a lot of yellow, but also a significant amount of red. And then on the road usage charge and the parking, that's where we're really kind of coalescing around the most people feeling it has promise, but also 20-ish% feeling, I need to think more, I need to discuss this more. But really, really interesting results. And I'm glad we did this one in addition to the no good, horrible ranking, because I think this gives us a little more of that nuanced spectrum. We're not going to talk a bunch about this tonight. Think of this as kind of fodder for our next time. I'm going to let our wonderful expert who got up at 3 a.m. to talk to us have the last word and kind of point us ahead to some of what we're going to be considering, as we go forward, and sort of what implementation considerations we might need to keep in mind. So Mariana, would you mind sharing your slides one more time so Dan can have his slide up there?
Thanks for reminding me of the time there, Emma. I was just getting over my tiredness, and now I'm like... So be sure I will try and take this quite quickly in order to get you all out into the summer evening, or the spring evening, but also so that I can go back to bed. So I might hop over some of these just to get through as quickly. You talked a lot about evaluation criteria and conflicting aims, and at least in the group I was in, there was a really rich discussion about what kind of more data you would need. I think my biggest reflection is that from the work I did in Vancouver, BC, this eventually came down to a trade-off between the out-of-pocket costs for individuals and how much demand management is enough. What is enough demand management? What is enough reduction of VMT? What is enough reduction of traffic delay, or whatever it is that you decide is the thing that you want to be concentrating on? There's a lot to learn from the response to COVID-19, and I see we're getting lots of really interesting traffic data and behavioral data. There's obviously all kinds of horrible negative impacts from COVID-19, but how people are responding to it, I think, is giving us really interesting data that's going to help us to calibrate all our models better. For me, I think one of the big lessons coming out of COVID-19 is actually not about the data, it's about the sometimes quick action is better than perfect action, and kind of understanding what kind of risks are we prepared to take, assuming we think that these problems around GHG emissions, around congestion, etc., around equity, if we think they're urgent, then maybe we sometimes need to act without perfect information. And you never have perfect information before you make a decision. That's not to say you have anything like enough information to be making big decisions now, and we've talked at length about the need for a lot more and richer data in particular. The geography question, I think there's always a trade-off, I think, between kind of having a large impact over a large area, or even a good kind of general impact over a large area, or having a really big impact in a local area. And again, we had a bit of a discussion in our group around that, and what parking charges in particular could do very locally, and kind of very almost surgically used in order to get the results you want where you want them. I think what I'd ask you is to maybe think about if there's a good place to start. Is there a part of Portland that has the more acute problems? There's more congestion, there's more GHG emissions, there's more air quality issues, there's more equity issues that we need to be considering, and maybe there's a way to start there. At the same time, is there a location where there is better access to alternatives, even if those are not perfect alternatives? Is there a location that has more alternatives than others? Is there a location where it's easier to provide better access to and from it, with full recognition of the fact that the results I've just seen on what you think of central cordons, and again from the discussion we had, there's some really good reasons and some really kind of valid nervousness around that. Again, some experience from Vancouver, we abandoned or ruled out a central city cordon quite quickly, and regretted it quite quickly, because now that's floating up to the top of the agenda for all kinds of reasons. So I think I'd caution moving away from that too quickly, but I think there's a lot of really good reasons to be cautious about it, and making sure that those are coming out, that you would need to address a long list of things in order to make that acceptable. Fairness and equity is obviously a big part of your remit. I wanted to point to some kind of almost quite basic fairness questions around, are the people who are paying in this system, are they getting big benefits? Conversely, are the people who are getting big benefits in terms of time savings, are they paying for that, or are they getting that for free? This is the kind of analysis that comes into the evaluation criteria question, and again became quite an interesting or useful evaluation point. Complexity and acceptance is the top of my mind because I'm in a panel discussion about it later today that I hope I can stay awake for. We know that the way to make these things fair and to make them equitable and to make them have the impacts we want, you need to build a package that's going to be quite complex. It's going to have lots of elements. It's going to need exemptions and discounts. And, you know, the pricing is not a tool you can ever use on its own. It needs to be quite a big, complex package. We also know that the more complex a package gets, the harder it is to build acceptance for it because people find it quite hard to get their heads around. So there's a really difficult tension between this complexity and acceptance. And I know next month you'll be talking a lot about what complementary strategies you will need, but thinking about how to kind of navigate that complexity versus the simplicity that sometimes you need in order to be gaining good acceptance. I think you probably all very well understood the need for an enormous amount of community engagement that's going to be needed before we can roll anything out, and understanding how this would impact people, assuming we even get to that point. I think a really important point here is two things, as lots of people have recognized during the meeting. This is really, really complex stuff. I've been working on this question for 20 years and I'm still learning brand new stuff, and I'm learned a ton of new stuff from you this evening. It was really great. But people are going to need a lot of time to get their heads around the complexity of this. We're going to need to really guide them through it. But also, even when we do that, almost no system has been introduced with more than 50% acceptance. So there will be lots of skepticism. And so you will need to have coalitions of support and coalitions of stakeholders in order to get this through. And then very quickly, just some pitfalls that I think it's important to avoid and that have got me into trouble when I've tried to progress these kinds of discussions before. And I think I heard this come up in a couple of discussions. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If we try and wait for the absolute perfect system, we're not going to succeed. One of the great things about charging is you can adjust it as you go. So you can implement something and you can adjust it afterwards. If you build a highway, there's very little you can do to adjust it afterwards. If you build a light rail line, there's not a great deal you can do to adjust it afterwards. You put in a pricing system, you've got quite a lot of flexibility to do all kinds of things with that in the future. Don't get too distracted by the technology. That doesn't mean ignore what you want the technology to achieve. So say what you want the outcomes to be, but don't necessarily worry exactly too much about how to get there. I'd say the same thing about legislation, to be honest. And I heard a lot of, we can't do this because we don't have the powers. None of the systems I've been involved in implementing did we have the powers in advance. We had to put together new primary legislation. That's not easy. It takes a while, but don't necessarily be restricted by what's legally possible today if there's a possibility that might get changed. I think I might stop there because we're running out of time.
That was great though, Dan. Thank you so much. We had Dan kind of front load this so we could hopefully avoid him waking up at 3 a.m. another month, but we just really want to say thank you and appreciate your sharing your wisdom and your expertise with us. We've learned a lot from you. Thank you to Kevin and Jeff as well. And I will close this out because it's 8:01. Our next meeting is going to be May 10th. We're going to talk about complementary strategies and kind of a little bit more about what Dan has just sort of seeded for us. And I know you're all survey monkeyed out, but if you have 30 seconds and want to share your thoughts on how this meeting went, I put the Survey Monkey evaluation link in the chat. Thank you all. Be well, stay safe, enjoy this blissful week of sunshine here in Portland. Dan, go back to sleep. And we'll see you all next month. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.